Got it. So today's topic is Shinhanga Japanese woodblock prints, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why this is interesting art to collect. A very brief history. I'll give you 300 years in about 3 minutes. And then I'll talk specifically about how the Shinhanga era came about. And then we'll look at lots of pretty pictures of my favorite artists. All things you can buy at arteclectic.com, by the way. So let me begin with that. All right, what am I doing wrong here? Well, there we go. So what is it about this art that makes it interesting? There's a lot of art one can collect, but this art is very affordable. Practically everything, 95% of it is between $200 and $800, $200, $900, something like that. So it all depends on condition and age and how popular the artist is, you know, scarcity and that sort of thing. But that's really quite affordable when you consider that good quality Dalis or Picassos or prints will cost you thousands. So, and I think they're beautiful. A little secret, the critics panned them back in the 1920s, but they've turned out to be incredibly popular. So what do the critics know? I think it's also a great cultural link to Japan. So if you have any interest in the Japanese, like I do, it's a nice way to learn about that country and their culture. And I think that it's a great investment. Many of the artists I'm going to show you today have doubled or tripled in the last 2 years in their prices. And you see a lot of things that they're not there anymore. So there's a kind of a historical nature to these prints. So what's a woodblock print anyhow? What you're looking at here are the wood blocks. So a way to make prints is either you carve in ink something that's metal, and it's called an etching, or something that's a ceramic or stone, and then it's called a lithograph, or you can do it in woodblock. You could also do it in linoleum. There's a lot of other ways you could do this, but the three most popular ways of conveying prints are through etchings, lithographs, and now we also have today photographs, offset lithographs. There's a lot of ways we can do it, but the idea is pretty much the same for those three. And what you try to achieve is every single block that you carve has a different color. So kind of like the art, like color separation that you do with silk screening, it's a lot like that. So you're going to actually take a piece of paper and you're going to ink one of these blocks, and then you're going to press it. So those, you'll paint the ink on there with the brushes. And then these round things are called barons, and they're used to press against the paper until it bleeds through so that you get all the ink on the paper. And then you'll do your yellows and your blues and your whatever different colors you have. And that's quite a laborious way to do it. It's a high labor activity. So it tends not to be done today. Today we'll do it, we'll automate it and do it in a printing fashion, usually with offset lithography, where we'll do the carving and then we'll make a rubber mold. They'll put that onto a drum and they'll just spin those things out. So that's poster art for us today. But this is takes real skill. It takes skill to come up with the design. It takes skill to carve the block, and it takes a great deal of skill to actually print it because you're doing it all by hand. So here's a case where I don't know if you can see what this is. This is actually the Great Wave. So here's the guys in the boat. Here's the wave. Now it's a reverse of what you would see because you're going to put the paper on it. Here's Mount Fuji. This was one done by Hokusai. And here's the guy doing it. See him pressing down the baron? And you can actually get shading by pressing harder in some areas than others. It creates a shading effect. It's just amazing they could do just doing it by hand. And that's how all of these prints are made. Let me talk about the history of it. And it pretty much matches the history of Japan. So Japan closed down for foreigners when the Tokugawa shogunate came in. So when this general ended the bloody civil wars in Japan. He shut the borders down. There were no Europeans allowed at that time, except for one small island in Nagasaki. They allowed some Portuguese priests to live there, and it was a man-made island, so it was pretty tiny. But other than that, you couldn't come on. You'd get arrested, killed, or thrown off, and that went on for close to 250 years. But the converse of it is the Japanese were insular and developed their own way of doing things that are quite unique. And as you will see, it affected. The only way you would be able to mass produce images was through woodblock prints. So by the time Commodore Perry showed up to reopen Japan, there were around 500 woodblock print artists with their team. So the woodblock printing is done pretty much in a team effort. So the artist is pretty much like he's the technical director, pretty much like the director of a film. And the publisher is pretty much like the producer. He's the guy backing everything. And then you've got the paper makers, the tool makers, the brush makers, the paint makers, the carvers, the printers. You have this whole team around you. So it was all done somewhat more like we would think of the way films are done today. Today, we think of artists doing everything. But back then, you really needed a good carver and you really needed a good printer, almost as much as a good design, and to get this done. Those were the creative people, really the skilled artisans, really. So, so from 1607 to the Meiji Restoration, which happened in 1868, and the shogun was replaced by the emperor and downgraded. It was very insular. It was reopened about 12 years before that. And suddenly, when the Meiji Restoration happened, there was this huge upsurge in showing Westerners to the Japanese and for Japanese to export things to the West. There was an incredible interest in these prints in Europe and America, particularly in Europe. They highly affected the Impressionists. If you go to Monet's house at Giverny, he has 250 Japanese prints on the wall, more than by his pals, the Impressionists. He was transfixed by them. You can even buy a catalog of just his Japanese prints. The Mikado, Gilbert and Sullivan. It was a thing called Japanisme, and it started with kind of an interest in the Far East anyway, but suddenly this whole idea of uncovering Japan stormed through Europe. Meanwhile, the Japanese flipped and went headlong for modernism. So they said everything that's Western, we're going to master and we're going to be good at. And suddenly they made, in about a 40 year span, they made a leap into a modern society from a feudal society, one where the daimyos or the lords controlled everything, and the shogun, they had fealty to a shogun. That all went away. And only the daimyo could ride a horse. They had no cars. They had no carts that were not pulled by people. You look at what happened. They built a modern army, which defeated the Russians in 1907. So one of the things that happened with their rush to modernity is that Japanese woodblock prints fell out of favor, and the nation went from 500 such artists to maybe a dozen or less. The last great woodblock print artist was a chap named Yoshitoshi. He committed suicide, did a lot of bloody pictures, and the art had almost died out. And then suddenly, this guy comes on the scene. His name is Watanabe. And Mr. Watanabe said, I can't let 300 years of artistry go to waste. And he almost single-handedly revised it. So he went out and recruited artists to become woodblock print artists. So maybe they were painters, painting on canvas or on screens, and he convinced them to learn the art of woodblock printmaking. And he put them together with the carvers and the printers and the other people, and that really changed everything. And it revived the whole art. But a funny thing happened. So you remember I said the West became very enamored with Japan in in the late 1800s. Well, the Japanese in their rush, they studied Western art. So all these artists that he recruited were aware of the idea of perspective, Western perspective, where there's a single vanishing point that the eye goes to when you look at a piece of art. That wasn't true in typical Japanese art. Um, so they had learned from the West, and when they started making the prints again, those artists made them with a Western perspective. So they're unlike the previous prints that had gone before them. This is from about 1916 until after World War II. And that era, to me, is one, they produced some of the most beautiful prints I've ever seen. And there was the way it got started was they had an exhibit at the Smithsonian that I went to, and I've been collecting prints for a long time by then, but I was completely thunderstruck by what I saw by artists like Hisui, the Yoshidas, Kazumatsu, Koitsu, these artists. And so we're going to look at some of what they did. Um, and like I said, it was almost all done between 1916 and 1957 when Hisui dies. So here's Mr. Watanabe. He's an old coot here in this one, but he's the guy that really made it go because he had the money and he was willing to recruit the artist. His store in 1940 on the left, and here it is today. You can still find it in Tokyo, still there, still go on and buy things there. As of 2019, I hope they haven't closed because of the pandemic. A lot of the people who sell this kind of art will go make deals and buy these things in bulk at a dealer price and then bring them back and sell them in the US. Another guy I want to give tribute to is an American collector by the name of Robert Muller. And if you ever spend any time doing buying prints in auction, it's always amazing how many times a print that was in the Robert Muller collection comes up because he had more than I do. So here he is on his honeymoon in 1938 with Watanabe. He's the guy down at the bottom. And Watanabe's assistant, the guy to his left, the chap with the funny spectacles, kind of goofy looking guy, that's Hisui Kawazi, and I'm show more of him. And here's Robert and his wife. They're on their honeymoon, actually. And he had been so interested in it that he wanted to bring more Japanese woodblock prints to America. He amassed a huge number. He left about 7,000 to the Smithsonian Sackler Gallery, now called the Asian Museum of Art, I believe, since they didn't want the word Sackler anymore. He died in 2003. And the other guy that was a big American collector was James Michener, who wrote all those giant novels. And he had a collection of about 10,000 prints that he left to the Honolulu Art Museum. I went there to look at them. They have about 15 on the wall, and they were obscure prints that weren't very interesting. And all I could think of is you have some of the greatest collection in the world, and you show them 15 at a time. It's kind of crazy. So there's Hisui. This is another chap named Shinsui Ito and his wife. He was a noted Shinhanga artist. Shinhanga, by the way, means new print. That's the literal translation of it. And they're in Mr. Ito's home. And this young, handsome chap right here is Shiro Kazumatsu. He's another one of the rising artists in the stable of Mr. Watanabe's artist. And because of Robert Muller, many exhibits were created and brought to the US. So Watanabe saved it, Muller Americanized it. Now let's look at some prints. Not sure how I'm doing for time, but I think we're okay. This is one of my favorite prints by Kawazi Hisui. Let me say a few words about names. These artists were a little bit like Madonna or Bono. They just like to use one name, that usually their first name, but not always, sometimes their last name, or they would change their names frequently, or they would adopt the names of their mentors. Hence you'll have Hiroshige 1, Hiroshige 2, Hiroshige 3, things like that. So getting used to how they name things is one of the Japanese things about their art to me, how they manage to do that. Asai, this particular shrine is in Tokyo in Ueno Park, and it's a pagoda The Tushogo Pagoda. It's rising behind the cherry blossoms in full bloom. You see a little crescent moon there on the side. And it was dedicated to Tokugawa Ieyasu, who's the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, the big shogun. It was originally built in 1617 during what we call the Edo period. So they renamed Edo, Tokyo, after the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration. And so the period before that, we often just refer to as the Edo period, from about the late 1600s to that point. That shogun, his son, Hidetada, became shogun as well. And they wanted to honor his father, and that was the building of this pagoda. As usual, it was burned down by a fire in 1650 and rebuilt in 1818. So 200 years after the fire, they rebuilt, almost 200, they rebuilt it. And each story of this 5-story pagoda represents a different element of earth, water, fire, wind, and ether or void in ascending order. Now, you'll see a lot of prints that will say that you're talking about a shrine if it's Shinto, or you're talking about a temple if it's Buddhist. And the question often becomes, is the pagoda the shrine? And the answer is no. The pagoda is not the shrine. It's kind of like a church steeple to say, there's something here you should see or attend. And that's what they did. They built pagodas to bring attention to the shrine or temple, and then they would have gates, fancy gates. So frequently you'll see a print that's named the shrine, but what you see is a gate or a pagoda. You don't really see the shrine. But again, that's just being Japanese. Look, there's something here to see. Here's another one. This one shows the gate and the temple, but not the shrine. This is the Zensu Temple in Sanshu. You see 2 women going through the gate here. One of the interesting things about Hasui is he loved to paint rain and snow. You would think that Japan was under constant precipitation if you just looked at his prints, because about half of them are that way. The Japanese love these prints a lot because they were into landscapes. In fact, most Japanese prints, about 75% are landscapes, and the rest are a combination of heroes, mythological characters. Pretty women were very popular. They were called bijin, and bijinga was a very popular art form. And they loved to have pictures of their kabuki actors in costume performing as somebody, kind of like we would think about movie stars in today's world. Behind the gate, you can see another 5-story pagoda that rises up to fill the background. This is a temple of Shingon Buddhism and is in Zensu City, located west-southwest of Takamatsu City. One more Hasui. I think this guy is an incredible artist. He's obviously my favorite because he went first. This is a picture of cormorant fishing in Nagaragawa. Gawa means river. Ji means temple. So a lot of times, and Yama means mountain. So when you see people talking about the Nagaragawa, they're really talking about the Nagara River. Or when they say Fujiyama, they're really talking about Mount Fuji. And if they refer to the Zensuji, they're referring to the Zensu temple. I say that because there's a tendency in a lot of books to be like saying pizza pie. They say the word in one language and then repeat it in another for some reason. So I don't do that on my stuff. I just try and translate or leave it be if the case happens. Now, what are these guys doing here? So on the water here, you see a bunch of cormorants that they have released. And they hold these lighted braziers or torches over the water. And small fish see that light and they get interested and they come up to check out the light. And when they do, the cormorants scarfle them down. And when this guy sees a cormorant scarfle, he pulls that cord and that chokes the cormorant so he can't swallow the fish all the way. Then they bring the fish up, they open them up and they they bring the cormorant up and then they pull the fish out. And when they got enough, they would take it to the emperor for his table. So it's an interesting way to fish. I guess the cormorants live a pretty sheltered life, but it sounds like a pretty hard way to get by. But many artists love to portray scenes like that. I think I have another one here coming up. Let me move on now to one of my absolute favorites, Hashiguchi Goyo. Goyo is known for, he has about a penchant for pretty women. So they're in various shapes of combing hair, bathing, putting on makeup, putting on lipstick, looking pensive, whatever it was. This is one of my favorites. And you'll notice that it says combing hair 1920, and he died in 1920. He would sketch them, and then he would supervise the creation of the print around it. But he died after only making a few prints. So his prints are very scarce and very expensive, although they have been reproduced as later editions in the 70s in particular. So in this print, we see a woman combing her hair. It was done in 1920 based on sketches he did in 1915 to 1918. It's such a rare print that it's been reproduced in lithographs as well. So you can often find them as a lithograph. He was the grandson of a samurai in Kagoshima City in the province of Kyushu. He had studied Western art at the Tokyo Academy of Fine Arts, and he was probably one of the most gifted and best students when he went through art school. He was recruited at the same time as Sasui, and I think he would have been a tremendous artist if he had done more than 13 prints. But unfortunately, he died. So there were 7 more prints published after his death under the supervision of other artists. That he had contracted meningitis at age 41. And so there were 7 more done after his death that Watanabe had done. But you'll see, this is a not to be missed artist, even though he has such little work. Now I want to talk about the family Yoshida. So this is, you're looking at a work by Hiroshi Yoshida. So Hiroshi, who you'll note was born during the Meiji era and lived up to 1950, was a prolific artist. He married into the court artists. So the court had a band of artists, the families that had been artists of the court of the emperor for many years. He married and he took their name. Yoshida wasn't his name, but he took their name because they were more famous than him. And he proceeded to become, he did work for Watanabe for about 3 years, and he figured out, he's getting all the money. So he created his own studio to be his own publisher. And it worked out well because his son was a famous artist, and all of his sons' were famous artists, and all of their wives were famous artists. So the Yoshida studio is a well-known source of prints. This Hijimi Castle was originally built in 1346. Throughout its history, it was owned by 13 different warrior families. One of whom was a commoner who became the de facto military dictator during the Civil War. It was reconstructed as a 3-storied castle in 1581, and then in 1601, his son-in-law, who was the Tokugawa shogun, had it transformed into the 5-tier castle you see here today. Now, here's the interesting thing about this one. It was actually done in 26, but most of the prints you find are from 1929. So when Hirohito became emperor, they tend to mark eras by the name of the emperor. When he became emperor in 1929, one of the American language newspapers in Japan decided to publish a book honoring the new emperor. And this was the print that was chosen. And one of the reasons I mention that is because it doesn't have his seal. They produced so many that he couldn't sign them. So usually what you see is a seal. So down here in the corner of this print, which is the Toshogu Shrine, you see his seal, but on that other one you didn't. So if you find one with a seal, it's a 1926 version. The ones without the seal were done in 1929. As I said, I don't think, all right, let me stop and give you my 2 cents here. It's an American viewpoint that the first edition, if in good condition, is the most expensive print. That's what we believe, but the Japanese don't think that way. They think if it's in good condition, every print's valuable. So later editions done during the artist's lifetime or posthumously can be just as good as the original. Remember, the artist doesn't do anything. It's the printer and the carver. And if you have the original blocks and you have the original printer, you're going to be able to reproduce the exact same thing they did the first time. So I kind of argue, buy prints that you like, because we Americans like to price things this way. Some of the later prints that are during lifetime or posthumous can be even better. You know, the printer got better as he made more. So maybe he made a 5,000, they made another 5,000. That second batch of 5,000 might be much better. You know, it just depends. So this shrine is not the shrine. It's actually the front gate of the shrine. It's again dedicated to the Tokugawa Ieyasu. He was the founder of the shogunate at the end of the Civil War. And it's located in Nikko in Tochigi Prefecture. And it's showing the gate, which is known as the Omotimon Gate. Yoshida redid this gate several different times. And you'll find that once they like someplace, they'll go back and do it different light, like the impressions. They'll do the same thing in a different light, or they'll move their chair to the other side and get a slightly different view. So he's a young looking guy, but he lived to be quite old. He also traveled a great deal. This is on his trip to India. This is the 5th view of the Taj Mahal that he painted that he created in 1932. He had a whole series of these in different lights: moonlight, sunlight, dusk, dawn, that sort of thing. One of the originals sold at Christie's in June of 2016 for 2,700 pounds. The last time I looked, it was available for sale at the Ronin Gallery for 7,200 pounds. Or if you go to the Ginza in Tokyo to the Shukata Gallery, you can buy it for $8,400. Number 6, the next one, is identical, only it's nighttime. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Hiroshi's son Toshi. So I have a whole talk just on this family. Toshi was groomed by his father to be a woodblock print artist. So he would travel with his father. So when they went to Burma, they would both be set up doing watercolors or paintings of the exact same thing, only his would look different than his father's. But his father wanted him to develop his own style. And Toshi did that. But he didn't like doing woodblock prints, although he was great at it. Well, he didn't like doing landscapes. So this is one of his landscapes. This is the supper wagon. And I think this print encapsulates many aspects of the Shinhanga movement. The subtle play of cool colors, it's a chromatic study. I love the way that the light behind these hanging drapes shines through the drape. And he did that just with color from a woodblock to a piece of paper. But doesn't it look like there's a light behind it? It's pretty amazing. And he has a dog that looks just like this that he's done quite a few woodblock prints of, with a curved tail. And this area here is behind the Ginza near the railroad station, and people would duck in here to get a quick bite, some buckwheat noodles, or maybe this is a yakitorium, or maybe it's a little sushi place. And so they'd be waiting for their train. They would dash around the corner to places like this, and they were called supper wagon. To me, this is an utterly charming print, and one of the reasons why I like them so much. Here's one that Toshi did on one of his trips to Africa. He lived till it says 1960, but he actually lived to 1990. And he did a whole series of studies of animals in Africa. He did quite a few of wildebeest. What you're seeing here is wildebeest running across the plain. I assume this is the Serengeti. But look at this, the way he captures this sense of movement. Now remember, this is a piece of paper that's been pressed against many different blocks of color. And what you have is a sense of movement that I don't know how he did it. I've studied it a couple of times. I wonder, how do you make things seem like they're moving in a two-dimensional picture like this? And he did it all. He did it many ways, because this is the 7th version of it. And I'm sure in others, the wildebeest are in different configurations. This is one of his more expensive prints because it's much longer than the normal. And here's another one I think is absolutely tremendous, the Half Moon Bridge. So this bridge is located at Camito, and what you're seeing hanging down here are wisteria blooms. And I always like to point out that the Japanese never perfected the arch, except for this bridges like this. So in the Western world, we have the arch as an architectural feature, and if you spin the arch, you get a dome, and it's the basis of much of our Western architecture. But the Japanese didn't have any of that, but they did have this, and because the load of all this wood has to be borne by these pylons and the anchors at either end, the bridges were always very steep type of construction, so that they could bear the weight properly. Toshi would write his name in the bottom in pencil. I've never figured out why they prefer pencil, but I guess that's an artist thing. And he would often write in English because he spent time like his father, he spent time in England, in the US. They've done pictures of the Grand Canyon and the Washington Monument. They were not simple people. So let's move on to, how am I doing for time? Looks like I'm okay. Let's move on to Shiro Kazumatsu. This guy to me is a rock star. Well, he's good looking enough to be a rock star anyway. This is a snowy day at the Red Gate of Tokyo University in Hongo. So this gate actually wasn't here to begin with. It was one of the ladies of the Tokugawa shogunate was given this gate when she was a bride in Tokyo, and it was on a feudal lord's estate, and it was later moved to become the entrance to the Tokyo National University in 1903, and moved again later. But it's still in existence, and it's a national treasure, as you can see. So I think Kazumatsu looks pretty much like he's following a trace with Hasui. I think his art looks a lot more like Hasui, and I think he's one of the 5 great Shinhanga painters. Here's his view of Kigun Falls at Nikko. This is almost 100 meters high, this fall, 100 yards high. And if you look, you can see the scale of it, because down here in the bottom are 3 little figures of people standing there looking at the falls. The other thing that I find amazing is the use of bokashi. That's how they press the baron to make the shading. It's called bokashi. And the bokashi on this is, look how the colors blend together. To me, it's unbelievable that you can put a piece of color on a piece of wood and rub it in such a way that you blend the colors so that it looks this natural. Quite skillful. And I'd love someday to visit Keegan Falls. Here's another he did of fireworks going off on a summer night. Terrific scene. So this is a country home, summer night, starbursts of orange and golden yellow sparks illuminate the dark sky. I think he's done a great job. It's a very striking image. Notice how the light, it's dark enough here at the bottom that the lights in the country house shine through. I just, quite interesting. Okay, here's almost our last artist, Koitsu. There were 2 Koitsus. There was one called Ishiwata. This one's Tsuchaya. Don't get them mixed up because they're both Shinhanga artists, but this guy's worth a lot more. Guess what these guys are doing? Cormorant fishing in the Nagaro River. This right here they're not cormorant fishing, this is a ferry, and these 2 guys are pulling the ferry. But meanwhile, out here in the river, they got their cormorants and their torches going, or their braziers going. They're looking for things. Koitsu was not part of the Watanabe stable. He broke away and worked for a lot of different other publishers. There was more than one publisher. And I think he's got quite a few interesting designs. This is the tea house on a back alley in Tokyo, Araki Yokocho. And I guess this is one geisha going in and one coming out. And you see a lot of scenes like this, scenes of sort of long gone Tokyo, where you very hard to find these places anymore, but the nostalgia for them was great. Let me mention one other artist that I really like. This guy is called Okada Koichi. He was commissioned by Watanabe to do a 12 series on Mount Fuji, which you see here in the background. This is a nighttime scene from Nihandera. And once again, I'm just blown away by how the use of color makes it look like lights. And in the distance, looming up against the dark night is Fuji. He has others with a spring day, on the shore with the waves washing, but he didn't like doing what he did. They were so great, but he didn't like doing them, that his 12 views of Mount Fuji ended when he stopped at 5 and went back to painting. And I think we're all the loss for it. I don't even have a picture of him. And I'll end with one last artist. This is Tokuriki. His full name is Tomikichiro Tokuriki. He was prolific. He lived a very long time. And he spans Shinhanga to the next level. So somewhere around the 1930s, the Japanese said, well, why don't we do it like the Westerners, and we'll have the artist carve the blocks and do the printing, and maybe they'll use a publisher, maybe they won't, they'll just self-publish. But basically, it's the artist does everything. And those are called sosukumana, otherwise known as creative prints. And this guy led the way. This is not one of his creative prints. This is one he did with a publisher and a team, but then he did a whole spate of them to create these creative prints. This is a soba vendor. He's here playing this little pipe to attract people to his soba cart. Soba is a buckwheat noodle that they like to eat. And Tokuriki, he's sort of the last of the Shinhanga artists, but he lived on till 1995 and did plenty of prints in both ways. Here's one more by him, the Kentai Bridge. This famous bridge is in Iwakuni City in Yamagachi Prefecture, and you see it under the full moon. It's there are 5 of these spans to get over the river, and this is as much as they could do on each one. And once again, it's still very steep. But look at the bokashi. Bokashi is shading. Look how the shading goes from a very dark blue to white. The skill of the printer is just so apparent when I look at this picture. So anyway, that concludes, and I'll be happy to take comments. You can find most of these prints, not all of them. Some are in my permanent collection, but you can find most of them at my page, arteclectic.com. That's the only commercial you'll get from me today, unless I'm asked to give more. Open for questions?